So basically you're saying that there could be a manual for statecraft.
Yes. If we, in these circumstances, don't accept the Israeli word, I can't stay working here. Clinton turns to me and he said, who does he think is a superpower? You don't want an honest broker, you need an effective broker.
You would expect that the leadership of American Jewry would be engaged with the national security of American Jewry. There is no excuse for the lack of engagement.
We have to create a better narrative about the value of the Jewish state and its contribution to civilization.
My name is Gidi Greenstein, and this podcast is my platform for exploring the condition and direction of the Jewish people. Flexigidity is a word I coined by combining flexibility and rigidity to capture what I believe is the secret sauce of Jewish resilience, recurring prosperity, and permanent leadership in humanity. It is also the name of a book I published 11 years ago with the title Flexigidity, the Secret of Jewish Adaptability and the Challenge and Opportunity Facing Israel. At the time, I observed that after decades of rising affluence and influence, the Jewish people might have passed its zenith and was entering a period of decline. Now, following the dramatic events of October 7 and Israel's war with Iran and its proxies, as well as the explosion of global anti-Semitism on the so-called October 8, it's time for a check-in. In this podcast, which I named Flexigidity, the podcast of the Hebrew man, I hope to orchestrate that discussion as someone who straddles both Israel and American Judaism. Professionally, I'm a societal entrepreneur and founder of the Reut Institute, one of Israel's most cutting-edge research, strategy, and leadership groups. I also founded Tikkun Olam Makers and spent years as a self-appointed peace diplomat. In addition, I'm a husband, father, and grandfather, and a committed long-distance runner. All of these aspects of my life will infuse this podcast. Dennis Ross represents a great tradition in Jewish history of Jews who ascended to highest position of influence in the courts of the great powers of their time, yet continued to care and where possible also help their people, sometimes even saving their community from extinction. Joseph, who became the viceroy of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, was the first such Jewish character. He took his entire family into Egypt, settled them in its most prosperous area, Goshen, and took care of them. Then came Mordechai and Esther, as well as Nehemiah in Persia in the 5th century BCE, Maimonides in Egypt in the 10th century, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel in the 15th century, and Adolphe Cormier, Benjamin Disraeli, and Leon Blum in France and England in the 18th to the 20th century. In America too, a number of American Jews rose to positions of great influence without forgetting their fellow Jews. Some of these names, like Louis Brandeis, Henry Morgenthau Jr., and Henry Kissinger, are probably familiar to our listeners, and each of them deserves their own episode. My friend, Ambassador Dennis Ross, continued this legacy. Dennis Ross is one of the great practitioners of American statecraft from the Cold War to the present day. Across 4 decades, he served as trusted advisor to Presidents Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, and Obama, shaping U.S. foreign policy at some of its most sensitive frontiers: arms control with the Soviets, the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, and peacemaking, as well as strategic engagement with Iran. Dennis was the lead negotiator at the Madrid Conference, the Oslo Process, and the Camp David negotiations. What makes Dennis particularly fascinating for this podcast is the path that he chose after his government service to remain in the field of diplomacy and strategy for the Jewish people. Most Jewish diplomats retired to academia or think tanks. Dennis too became a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs. But in addition, he chose to become chairman of the Jewish People Policy Institute, JPPI. To me, this means that strategic thinking for the Jewish people was always on his mind. Meanwhile, throughout this period, he authored and co-authored a number of books. The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace in 2004, Statecraft, and how to restore America's standing in the world in 2007, Myth, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East with David Makovsky in 2009. Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel relationship from Truman to Obama in 2015. Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny with David Makovsky in 2019. And now he's publishing the second edition of Statecraft 2.0. Ross's career invites probing questions. Was there a moment when he felt conflict between his service of presidents and his notion of what is good for Israel and for the Jewish people? How does he apply the art of statecraft that he honed in the service of the United States to the future of the Jewish people? I can think of only one person that can speak to these issues, and that is Dennis Ross. Dennis, thank you for being here. Let's dive in. Dennis, it's great to have you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so basically I just want to, if you could take us down a quick walk down memory lane, just tell us where you grew up. How did your family legacy and your earlier experiences shape who you are today?
Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was socialized in a lot of ways by the Vietnam War, meaning political activism became something I identified with as a result of that. I was never a pacifist, but I also thought that the war, there's a term that emerged from the war called wasted. The terminology when people were killed, on our side, they would say they'd been wasted. And somehow that captured not the reality of the loss of this life, but the idea that the nature of the war was a war that was governed not by an understanding of what we'd gotten into, not by an understanding of the real strategic stakes or a misunderstanding of that, but instead a kind of assessment that there was the domino theory, and if you didn't stop the North Vietnamese or the communists in Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia would be lost. And then the dominoes would keep falling. And as Lyndon Johnson said, if we don't stop them there, we'll have to stop them in San Francisco. We'll have to stop them in the United States. And it was just a wrong-headed approach. It was a lack of understanding of, what we were getting into, was also a lack of understanding of what our objective should have been. So I became an activist in that setting, an activist in the political context. I was at the Ambassador Hotel the night Bobby Kennedy was killed because I was working for him in one of my first serious political efforts to be involved. And that had a searing impact on me. I was committed to the sense of public service that he embodied. I was committed to kind of the vision that he laid out for what youth in America should be doing. So these are the kind of things that sort of shaped me early on. What got me interested in the Middle East was I took a trip to Israel in 1970. I was still a student, because before I was still an undergraduate. And I read Chaim Weizmann's autobiography, Trial and Error, on that trip. And it gave me this very strong connection. I'm Jewish, but I grew up in an religious household. So my interest in Israel began from more of a secular Jewish perspective. I would say that's really sort of the baseline, even though I became more observant when I got married, because my wife was not Orthodox, but she was much more committed to the ritual, a ritual that I really didn't even know. So I evolved over time from that standpoint. Belong to a conservative shul now. Founded along with one of your friends as well, Tom Friedman. And that's kind of the broad overview of where I came from and who I am.
So it's actually very interesting that you mentioned Chaim Weizmann, who was really a remarkable diplomat for the Jewish people in the early 20th century, credited, I believe, for one of the greatest achievements in modern history of the Jewish people, which is the Balfour Declaration. And that happened because of Chaim Weizmann and his legendary work. And also Chaim Weizmann, I think a little bit like you, is a person that served a great service to his country, England, the United Kingdom, which then gave him the ability to influence politics and influence diplomacy in a matter that was so important for our people. So Dennis, just can you define statecraft for us?
Yeah. Look, the essence of statecraft is how does a state use all the tools at its disposal? The tools, the instruments, the means. The tools are essentially diplomatic, economic, intelligence, military, informational, organizational. I mean, everything you can imagine that a state has in terms of its toolkit, how you organize and implement and use those tools in the service of your objectives. Good statecraft is always characterized by marrying objectives and means. One of the things I do in my new book is basically explain why so often we're not able to do what seems obvious. When I open my statecraft course that I teach, I say, okay, so good statecraft is characterized by marrying objectives and means. Well, that's obvious, right? Why would you pursue anything if you couldn't marry your objectives and means? And yet it's more the exception than the rule. And it's more the exception than the rule, mostly because we don't tend to define the right objectives. I mean, sometimes we fail to define the right objectives because we haven't thought them through. Sometimes we define the wrong objectives because they're adopted for political reasons. Lyndon Johnson adopted the objective on Vietnam for political reasons because he thought that if he lost Vietnam, the Republicans would exploit that the way they had exploited who lost China. Completely disconnected from the reality of what we're getting into. But that's what governed him. Sometimes we adopt the wrong objectives because we just don't understand, not because of a political failing, but because our assessments are terrible. And we don't understand what we're getting into. And George W. Bush going to war in Iraq, he did not understand what we were getting into because the assessment was driven by a best case assumption that if you cut off the head of the snake, meaning Saddam Hussein, everything would fall into place, it wouldn't fall apart. So there's a lot of different reasons why we get the objectives wrong. And you know, the one of the conclusions I came to after writing this book, which was actually my second book on statecraft, I wrote a first book on statecraft back in 2006. The world had changed so much. The world was, it was a unipolar world in 2006. Well, it's no longer a unipolar world. We're more constrained on the outside. But even though Iraq was debated, there was still a consensus in the United States that we should assume a leading position internationally. Well, we don't have that consensus today. So because the world is so different on the outside and because the lack of a consensus on the inside, I felt, all right, I need to write a new book on statecraft. And so I did. And so this focus led me to sort of focus again on why do we have such a hard time marrying objectives and means? And it led me to a conclusion that I used to teach in this course. This is more organic. It can't be mechanical. But I've come to the conclusion, one of the ways to ensure you do adopt the right objectives and really do think through what you need to do is to ask a series of questions about your objectives. Yeah. Everything is too often taken as a given. Assumptions are never assumptions are never really taken a hard look at. You don't question your own assumptions. And I think asking a set of hard questions, even if they're listed almost in mechanical form, ends up helping you to steer you in a direction that's much more productive.
So basically you're saying that there could be a manual for statecraft, and there could be some sort of a set of steps and boxes that could be checked to reduce the risk that you would end up in a major fumble like we have seen it so many times in history. Dennis, so now let's try to apply this notion of statecraft to the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people, first of all, when you apply statecraft to a state, you assume that there is a centralized decision-making, there is a top executive, there is kind of an organized mechanism. The Jewish people is flat. There is no pope. There is no president or prime minister of the Jewish people. So that's one major difference. And the other major difference is that we don't think about the Jewish people as a singular entity. We think about it as, even the way we write it, right? We say Jewish with a capital J, and then people, small p, as if Jews as opposed to the Jewish people, right? So how do you apply the notion of statecraft to the Jewish people?
Well, you've identified what makes it profoundly different than a state. That doesn't change the reality that the Jews are a people. They have a state. The nation state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. the connection between that state and the diaspora, if Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, means that state has a special responsibility for all Jewish people, not only the Jewish people who are living in Israel. So you start with that as a kind of premise, and you then ask the question, okay, how do we measure where we are? How do we need to be thinking about, I would even say, strategic planning for the Jewish people? What are some of the challenges to the Jewish people that we need to be contending with? What is the role that Israel, because it has a state structure, what role can it play? How does it relate to national Jewish organizations, of which there are many? How do you create connections there? How do you get them to focus on what's most important for them? Because you're not a unitary actor here, it's not so simple to simply construct, okay, what are our objectives? But you can take a step back, and Israel can ask questions about what are the most important concerns we have for the Jewish people? Well, one thing is, how do we make sure they thrive? A related one is, how do we minimize threats? Then you ask, okay, what are the threats? So how does one deal with those threats?
Just before you go down this path, I do want to mention that this is I found this to be one of the greatest paradoxes of Israeli national security, right? Everybody agrees that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, which makes Israel very unique. No other country says, hey, I'm France, I'm the nation state of the French people. No, I'm the state of the French. Okay, very unique structure of the Jewish people, of Israel, which basically means that a central element of Israel's national security relates to the Jewish people. But when you look at the talent, and Dennis, you know this better for decades and decades, if you look at the talent of the Israeli National Security Council, there are barely any people that understand the Jewish people. In the National Security Council of Israel today, you have more people that will be able to talk to you about Egypt or Iran or Jordan or the Palestinians than about UJF Federation of New York and the Jewish community of New York. So there's really a structural mismatch in Israel between the national security mission on the one hand and the structure of the institutions on the other hand. And now you're actually adding an additional layer, which is with this mismatch to have a substantive conversation about, interests, about structure, about institutions. So I just think that what you're talking about is really a huge aspirational conversation for Israel.
It is. Your point is really well taken, because many of the people who have shaped Israeli foreign policy and national security policy, they view the Jewish people as an asset from the standpoint of supporting us. They don't view the Jewish people through the lens that, well, maybe there are things we need to support them. What happens? How do we think about the impact of our policies on them? I mean, for 20 years, I have raised, since the beginning of the JPPI, every discussion I had with the Prime Minister and others wasn't obviously limited to this issue, but I would raise the question, you need to bear in mind, you make decisions here. You are the nation state of the Jewish people. You make decisions here that can put different Jewish communities around the world at risk. You have a responsibility to think through what is the impact of your decisions on different Jewish communities. The sociology in Israel has been such that the instinct has been, look, they're out there to support us, not we're here to be supporting them. And maybe since October 7th, 2023, there's been a little bit of a shift in that sort of balance. I wouldn't exaggerate it, but there's more awareness because the increase in anti-Semitism, the assault on different Jewish communities around the world, even what we're seeing here in the United States, should put at a higher premium the Israeli understanding that they bear this responsibility and they haven't created structures that are very good at dealing with it.
Exactly. So we have the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, but the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel, first of all, is not a major player in the national security decisions of Israel. And also a lot of times it's given some sort of as a political gift to a minister who is often not in a senior position in government. But I do want to go back, just to, I think for Israel's credit, there are a few areas where Israel does take full responsibility for the Jewish people. We know that defending Jewish communities around the world is one of the primary responsibilities of the Mossad. So there is a lot of investment over there. Israel sends Hebrew teachers around the world, so there's that as well. etc. But other than that, it's a very, very weak area, I would say, an undeveloped area in Israel's national security, which leads me to the American side. American Jews are 80% of world Jewry. You would expect that the leadership of American Jewry would be engaged with the national security of American Jewry or the national security of the Jewish people. And here, there's no excuse for the lack of engagement or thought or conversation.
You're right. And just as there's kind of a legacy of where different Israeli leaders look to the diaspora to be a source of support, not a source of criticism or questioning, not a focal point of Israeli responsibility, even if the declaratory posture being the nation state of the Jewish people implies there is that responsibility. The flip side of that has been many Jewish leaders from the Jewish leadership, the organized Jewish community, tend to feel their role is to be supportive of Israel and not to be asking Israel, right, what can you be doing to help in terms of the problems that we face? We're not asking for you not to expect a degree of support from us. We will always have a degree of support for Israel, but we're asking to make this a two-way street because it's necessary to make a two-way street. You can't be both the nation state of the Jewish people and then ignore what are the needs of the Jewish people outside of Israel.
So I'll just, I think there's an interesting aspect to that, but I'll say more. You know, in Israel, you have multiple groups, government and non-government. Think about the future of Israel in 10 years, 25 years, right? Non-governmental groups like what we call the fourth quarter, 2048. You know, all these groups, the 100 initiative, 100 years initiative. These are all groups that are looking 20 years into the future of Israel. There's no equivalent for that for American Jewry at all. Nothing of that exists here. And then you have in government, you have long-term planning. Over here, who's doing long-term planning for American Jewry and for world Jewry? Let's speak about American Jewry. Again, it's like an empty field. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we could say that the government of Israel is not doing its share, but I think it's fair to say that the leadership of American Jewry today is not paying enough attention for its own national security. And I know there is kind of a tension between national security and the Jewish people. You know, there's like a little bit of tension in terms here. But I mean, there's definitely an open field here. Dennis, maybe for you.
Well, look, I think one of the things that the JPPI has been trying to do is to create more of a nexus between the two, to focus on issues even like civic education in Israel as a way of building a greater sense of understanding of civic responsibility. But that, I think, is in part designed also to create a different image about Israel in the States. One of the things that's happened is that we have more and more, I would say, more and more elements in the Jewish community in the States that have become more questioning of Israel in a way that was never the case before. Now, that can be a strength. Right now, I think it's still viewed in Israel, it's viewed more as a weakness as opposed to a strength. The reason I raise it is because I think one of the challenges for Jewish leaders here is to remain relevant in their own communities. And there's more and more questioning, at least prior to October 7th, there was more and more questioning about the direction Israel was going in. Now I think there's a divide demographically. The younger Jewish population is connecting with their demographic cohort and have raised serious questions about what they see as Israel's strategy in Gaza. The death and destruction there has had an impact, less on those who are 40 and older and much more on those who are 40 and younger. A challenge for the Jewish leadership here is to find ways to address that, find ways to introduce an informational base to them. You know, many of them sort of fall victim to what is a narrative that finds Israel at fault for everything, and there isn't a counterpoint there to explain, to challenge that. I go around the campuses, by the way. I will have done 20 campuses this year in addition to my own teaching. You know, and I confront questions among students like, well, isn't Israel a colonial state? And I go through and say, no. There has always been a deep historic connection to the land. Always. And by the way, this is not an empire that was being served, trying to draw resources out of it. These were people returning to what was their homeland, the source of their identity.
And until 1948, every square inch the Jews lived in the land of Israel, which is important for everybody to remember, it's kind of a trivial fact, was bought for over market price. Almost every single square meter the Jews lived on until 1948 was bought by over market price, because the Arab owners knew that the Jews were pay over market price. So at least until 1948, it's totally legitimate. After that, of course, there is a whole clash of narratives between our side and the Arab side. Let's put that aside. I do want to ask you, to the extent that you can...
But it's relevant to what's happening in the younger demographic of the Jewish community here. That's why I raised it.
Yeah, of course. Well, I do think that one of the key... If we could imagine, I think this is kind of an intellectual challenge. If we could imagine American Jewry, you used earlier a concept called unitary actor. If we could imagine American Jewry and world Jewry as a unitary actor that can make decisions, right, and prioritize, what would you say which is essential for statecraft, right? Statecraft is a very kind of rational exercise, objective means, making sure that they align, right? So if we could do that exercise for American Jewry, what would you say are the key objectives, in the next decade?
Look, I think right now, security is number one objective. How to ensure security. Number two, much deeper Jewish education. Here I'm talking about I'm not talking about narratives the way we were before, but focusing on those elements that deepen the sense of Jewish identity. Because I think this has been a perennial concern. I think it's a more legitimate concern right now. Younger people, I think, are simply not affiliating. So what are the kind of institutions that will preserve a sense of Jewish identity? Partly it's related to education. Jewish camps, summer camps, are a really good way to socialize a sense of identity. Thinking about alternatives to the synagogue, at least the way we've defined the synagogue historically, so that it becomes more open, so that it's less rigid, so that people can go to places. There's kind of a new avant-garde that's being developed in terms of Jewish education, and even the way you define a synagogue, much more open, much less tied to you're either Orthodox, conservative, Reform, or Reconstruction. A whole new kind of definition, treating synagogues as something that's more a focal point for community and learning, as opposed to the just exclusive focus on ritual. So these are the kind of things I would emphasize as objectives, as a way of preserving. You have to deal with security, but you also have to preserve identity.
Right. So let's just, I think, obviously you mentioned a few things. I would throw in also leadership. We need a leadership pipeline that thinks in the terms that we're talking about. We have obviously a lot of leaders, but they're not thinking about the issues that we're talking about right now. You obviously need to educate people. I'm putting all that aside. I want to focus with your guidance on the issue of security.
Yeah.
And just to deploy the notion of statecraft, right, objectives and means to the issue of security, I'd like to kind of prompt you with the following. I happen to do security in my synagogue. So we stand in front of the door. In the best case scenario, if there is an attack, we are the bodies that will take the bullets of the attack. But that's way too late. We depend on government relations. We depend on community relations. So really the outer layers of the security of our community is community relations, is government relations, right? So if I ask you, we didn't think about it beforehand, you didn't have time to prepare, but if I said, okay, Dennis, now you think 10 years into the future, how do you think about, the security and safety of the community?
Look, it's interesting. I just did a talk to Temple Emmanuel in New York. I was struck by the police presence when I got there. It was really very significant in terms of numbers. Now,
maybe it's because of you.
I'm not sure, but what I was, what's the best way to ensure security? Create deterrence. So what I would be focused on is first, with cities or municipalities, sitting not just with police forces, but also the mayor's office to emphasize, okay, what can we do? What more can we be doing with you on our own? You know, what would you advise us to do on our own? What are you prepared to do in terms of providing resources to help with the security? Well, we're facing what is an entirely different threat these days. In the past, the Jewish community was always concerned about the threat from the right. Well, now we have recent examples of the threat from the left is not rhetorical. It was quite violent, and we've lost people because of it. So I think there's a need not just to be talking to law enforcement, there's a need to be talking to political leaders in the local communities, whether it's cities, townships. I think there's a need to have a kind of open and regular dialogue there. I would take it another step because I think you in the States.
Which by the way, I think what you are highlighting is the crucial significance of what we call in America community relations.
Yes.
And the crucial importance of investing in this field because I've done, as you know, I've done some work on dealing with the delegitimization of Israel and the BDS movement, and I know that in every attempt to delegitimize Israel or to lead a BDS effort that was blocked, a relationship that was cultivated over years was deployed. And these relationships are crucially important. Anyhow, sorry, I interrupted.
I couldn't agree more. This is not a light switch where you flip it and everything's going to be fine. And it's also not something that you can work on only on one stream of thought or one dimension.
Or on a transactional basis. You have to build a relationship over time. Authentic.
You have to have a multiplicity of actors that you're working with. And you also, and this gets to the heart of what you're saying, you have to build a relationship. You don't build relationships instantly. That means you seek out those who you should be engaging with, and you basically say, look, this is a dialogue that we would like to have with you on an ongoing basis. And we're not coming in with a blueprint. We want to develop one with you jointly because we understand that the more we work mutually, we'll come up with ideas that neither one of us had on our own. So I would like to see Jewish communal leaders and those who are the lay leaderships in synagogues. I would like to see them working together. I would like the Jewish communal leaders to identify who are the right kind of actors in the municipality or the city who you should be engaging with aside from law enforcement. It's not to exclude law enforcement, but it's also to engage political actors who become much more sensitive to what's going on once you engage in a conversation with them. So this is, I think, a kind of, it's not just a near-term priority, it's really an imperative if you're going to deal with what is this objective that we're both describing as, okay, the security and well-being of Jewish communities in the States. By the way, the Israelis have a lot to offer in terms of how they approach security. We should have, you talked about the role of Mossad, but I would say, you have a security establishment in Israel that has come up with what are the best ways to secure the state. How do we deal against certain threats? Well, obviously, some of this is intelligence. So here again, some of the people you need to deal with are people who deal with domestic sources of violence, and therefore we have this brings you to police, the FBI, who have intelligence units who will focus on who are potential threats. But I think the advice that you can get from Israelis who do security, who can come over and offer an assessment, it's another way to create a stronger bridge and a linkage between the Jewish community and the state of Israel.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I do want to mention two things. Obviously, the technological tools that are being used in Israel are under a different legal system. And a lot of the things that are being done in Israel to ensure security may have a legality issue here in America in terms of data, personal information, etc. So For sure, we know that all over the world, this is a major priority for Israel, and it's unseen. It's secret. It's intelligence. So, people don't know the amount of effort that Israel puts into protecting Jews all over the world. But I do want to say something else that I believe, which is kind of philosophical about security. And that's the reason why, to me, this is the reason why American Jewry is the greatest diaspora of not only of our time, of all times. And the United States is the best host country in history for the Jews because of one major element, and that is the federalist system, the division into states. So in all cases in history, the demise of the Jewish community came when the law enforcement forces were weaponized against the Jews. We see it in Egypt, we see it in Persia, we see it in Germany and in other places. But in the United States, LAPD and NYPD don't have the same commander. They don't respond to the same authority. So because it's a decentralized internal security mechanisms in America, the Jews here are safer than any other place in history. And I think this is kind of, it's very important underlying factor here. On our conversation of security.
But I would say, just to build on this, you have the federal system, you have the state system, you have the city and local communities all having their own security, police, law enforcement mechanisms. And it actually is important it's actually important for the Israelis, but also important for the Jewish community to try to engage at every level. Partly the state legislators will create legislation tied to what can be done as it relates to security, but also they will be the ones who allocate monies so that, in fact, the security needs can be addressed. It's interesting. It is, and you're right, it's a unique strength of America, but it also gives Israel and the Jewish community multiple points of access to those who can be responsive and helpful. And the more you build a kind of a coalition, a set of alliances at each level, the stronger this will be. They become reinforcing. When you have very strong state and local support, it builds the potential to have greater federal support as well. This is it's a two-way system, and we need in the Jewish community to be very mindful and sensitive to it.
Yes. Dennis, I know we skipped right into the phase of your remarkable career where you were not in government and you were free to be both an American, to pronouncedly Jewish, etc. You have family in Israel. By the way, your son, I had the honor of him working for me in the past. So we've known each other for a long time, and also we're family. Remember that. By marriage, we're all family. So
we have these multiple connections, just like the multiple connections we're talking about.
Exactly. But I do want to take you back to your period in government, right? You started in the era of the Cold War. You moved into Middle East diplomacy, Israeli, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, and so on. Was there ever a moment where you felt that the interests that you were serving as an American, working for the American government, and the interests of the Jewish people or the state of Israel were actually in tension with each other, not even in conflict, in tension?
Yeah. Yes, there was one moment. I'm often asked variations of this question. And people say, was there ever a point where you felt you had to resign over a point of difference on policy? And the answer is no, not over a point of difference on policy, because I always felt if the policies that were being pursued were so much against what I believed in, I wouldn't stay anyway. But the issue for me was, as long as I had my day in court with the president, I wasn't the elected one, the president was the elected one. If he was going to make a decision, as long as I had a chance to lay out what I thought needed to be the case, if he decided against me, I could live with that. Now, obviously, if there was a consistent pattern of that, then I'd say I really couldn't be in the administration because it was going down a track that I simply disagreed with. But there was one point where I felt it was a point of principle. It was during the first Bush administration, and it was over an intelligence approach. I won't get into all the details, but I'll suffice it to say it involved what was considered to be a breach by the Israelis of something of weapon systems we had given to them, and that they had somehow shared with the Chinese, sharing the technology with the Chinese. And at the time, this was, as I said, it was during the first Bush administration. Salai Meridor was the closest aide to Misha Aarons, who was then the foreign minister. And I called him up, and I said, look, we have information that you may have shared the following technology with the Chinese. And obviously, if you did, this is a really serious problem that will have consequences. And I'm calling to give you a heads up, but also to find out what's the story. And Salai, who's a very honest guy, I'm sure you know him, he's a very honest guy. He said, give me 24 hours to check. Now, I went to Baker and I said, he's going to check. And what he comes back with, then we'll know. But I said, I even previewed what I felt was going to be the case. I said to Baker, look, if he comes back and says they didn't do it, he doesn't know what we know. So there's no way they're going to lie to us, because we can expose them in a lie. We're basing this on a particular intelligence source who's probably also being paid by us. So if there's a choice between the Israelis who don't know what we know, telling us they haven't done it, and responding to this source, that can't be a choice. That the decision has to be very clear, and we accept what the Israelis tell us. So Salai came back 24 hours later, and he said, we didn't do it. So I went to Baker and I said, they didn't do it. And they are saying this because, they didn't do it. If they're trying to lie to us, we can expose them in the lie. So I said, let's make that decision. He said, well, if the president hasn't decided yet. And I said, well, we're going to convey this to him, so he should decide. And he said, well, I'm not sure what he's going to decide. And I said, well, I'm sure what I will decide. If we, under these circumstances, don't accept the Israeli word, I can't stay working here. And wow. Baker said to me, well, I'm sure it's not going to come to that. And I said, I'm sure it won't come to that if we do the right thing. I do believe what happened is Baker, in the aftermath of that, went to the president and sided with me, and I think that's what helped to decide this. But I felt really strongly on that, because here was someone who I trusted, but I also knew was honest. But I said we were in a position where they didn't know what we knew, and if they were lying to us, we would have exposed it.
Dennis, I want to take you to the other side, which is, again, you served on 3 major issues that are closely related to Israel. And I just want to tell you, and we don't have a lot of time, so really highlights, where did you felt like a absolute alignment? We always say that, America-Israel alliance is strongest when the interests are aligned, meaning you don't need to test the relationships by having conflicting interests. The interests are aligned, so the relationship is great. So Cold War period, Oslo negotiations, Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Palestinian, then Iran. Where did you feel the alignment absolutely existed? It was like total synchronization.
Obviously, it can be affected by different administrations on both sides. But I felt early on, the one total alignment was actually basically in the Cold War. There was an evolution on our side, because the historical attitudes of the State Department and the intelligence community, even to a certain extent the Pentagon, were that the Arabs were where our interests were. Caspar Weinberger had this view that we need the Arabs. He was a reflection of every administration up until that time, but it wasn't the reflection. It didn't embody either Ronald Reagan or George Shultz. And I felt at that time, once Reagan made certain decisions, mostly driven by Shultz, that there was a complete alignment. And we could disagree on some issues, but there was a fundamental alignment. We saw things the same way, and you had a leadership that basically saw Israel as a real asset, not just a function of this is a country where we shared values, but they saw Israel as a real asset as well. That was, I think, the strongest. Later on, under Rabin and with Oslo again, I felt there was a complete alignment in terms of the approach. You have a change in government. When Bibi came in, there was less of an alignment on these issues.
Just to say that Netanyahu came in May 1996.
Correct.
So Rabin goes from November 92, he's assassinated November 95, and then Shimon Peres is from November 95 to May 96, and then Netanyahu comes in for the first time.
Right. No, the very first meeting that President Clinton had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, at the end of that meeting, Clinton turns to me and he said, "Who does he think is a superpower?" So, but he was prepared to work with him, and he did.
And Iran under Obama?
I would say there was not an alignment on that. There was an understanding on Obama's part that this was he understood it was an existential threat to Israel. He accepted that. And he understood we had an obligation to deal with that. That I think was very genuine in his part. But he always wanted to be able to produce an answer to it diplomatically. And he always had a suspicion that Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't favor a diplomatic approach, favored a military approach. I think the truth is, Prime Minister Netanyahu, throughout that period, believed that a diplomatic approach actually was possible, but it required us exercising a lot of leverage and pressure on the Iranians. He had a view that if the Iranians saw the price was high enough, you could resolve this diplomatically. And he felt they would give in more to that. I think Obama at times feared the threat of the use of force would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there wasn't a total alignment on that issue. There was a recognition of the seriousness of the issue, but not a total alignment on the issue.
But in terms of your service at the time, did you feel that you're doing something that is undermining Israeli interests, or you were saying, hey, Netanyahu's assessment, I don't accept the assessment. He may be the prime minister of Israel, but there are a lot of people in Israel that supported the diplomatic engagement with Iran.
No, there was. And look, my own position was, I thought there was a way to achieve things diplomatically, but I also was actually, my assessment was closer in some ways to Bibi's than it was to many others within the administration. There was a tendency on the part of some to believe that it was too risky to be threatening certain things with the Iranians. And I always felt, look, if you look at I'll just say this, there was, on March of 2009, President Obama wanted to have a discussion with the key people on Iran. And so first 6 months I spent working for Secretary Clinton. And she came over with me and Bill Burns, and the purpose of this meeting, as the president said, I want to have an analytical discussion. I don't want this to be a discussion that focuses on here's what we have to do. I want to understand the nature of the issue. I want to have a discussion where we can stretch our own thinking, but we're looking at this more analytically than from a policy standpoint. And Hillary asked me to make a presentation to start the discussion. And I said, one of the things that drives the Islamic Republic is self-preservation. And we can look at them. They will never change who they are. They're not going to redefine who they are. They're not going to sort of accommodate us and change who they are. But if you look at their behavior, when they are really pressed, when they see themselves as being risked because self-preservation, regime preservation is the first objective, they will make tactical adjustments. And I went through and I cited the changes in behavior when the price was high as they saw it. So the Supreme Leader, Khomeini, ends the war with Iraq after saying, we'll fight it forever, because they were invaded by Iraq. And after we reflag the ships and the price goes up to them because we start sinking their navy and we destroy oil platforms, and we inadvertently, they think it's not inadvertent, but we shoot down a civilian airliner. Suddenly, Supreme Leader says, it's like drinking poison from a chalice, but we're going to end the war. Because it was too dangerous to be involved in a war with us. In the 1990s, I explained, the Iranians stopped assassinating dissidents in Europe because the Europeans were about to impose sanctions. This wasn't even the threat of military force, but it was the threat of sanctions. In 2003, after we basically we hadn't yet captured Saddam Hussein, but he fell within 3 weeks, and the Iranians thought they were next. They came with a very forward-leaning proposal to end their military support for Hezbollah and Hamas, to basically freeze their nuclear developments in return for a set of understandings with the United States. And we hadn't applied sanctions, but basically are not putting pressures on them. The Bush administration at the time didn't take us. They thought, gee, they must be on their last legs if they're offering something like this. It was a mistake not to pursue it. Anyway, I cited these as examples that showed when the pressure as they saw it, or the risk as they saw it, was high, they adjusted their behavior. And I said, this is the approach we should take. This is an approach that can make diplomacy work. It's not an alternative to diplomacy, but it reflects, especially with the Iranians, but more generally, there is a coercive element to diplomacy, and you have to understand it if you're going to be successful. By the way, coercion can be both negative but also positive. It can involve inducements as well. So it's leverage, and good statecraft always depends upon being able to exercise leverage.
Beautiful. Dennis, there is something that I do with all of my guests here, which is I ask a standard ChatGPT question, 2 of them, and offer you the opportunity to respond. So I'm going to the question is, what is the biggest praise and the biggest critique of the guest, meaning of you? So actually, because of what you said, I want to start with the praise. So what is the biggest praise of you? Here's what ChatGPT says. The highest praise of Dennis Ross centers on his extraordinary skill as a diplomatic strategist. Listen to this. His institutional memory and credibility with both sides, and his decades-long commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. He's widely recognized as the most experienced American negotiator of the Arab-Israeli conflict of the modern era. So that's very nice. This is like out there in the cybersphere. But I do want to say something that everybody that listened to you in the last couple of minutes could have seen, your institutional memory. And we always, when I was part of the Israeli negotiation team, and throughout these years, we always said, Dennis has the institutional memory. He knows what happened. He knows all the arguments everybody made back and forth over the years. And on top of that, you seem to have this incredible memory and the ability to pull out all this history for every question is being brought up. So, when people speak about institutional memory in individuals, it sounds amorphous, but anybody listened to you in the last 3 minutes saw a demonstration of what it is.
Well, we also know, look, I'm going to mention somebody that you also had enormous respect for on our team, Jonathan Schwartz.
Oh, yes.
Nobody had more institutional memory and of every possible way to look at this through a legal lens. He had no peer. And you'll recall both the Israelis and the Palestinians would say, look, we would like to get advice from him. And I was keen on having him give that advice. So, I mean, I'm not alone in terms of institutional memory. Maybe at the level I operated, I was.
So Dennis, here is the critique, okay? The most substantive critique laid against you is the following. Dennis was too closely aligned with the Israeli positions, thereby undermining the United States' credibility as an honest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Here's your opportunity to respond.
Well, I will respond. And now, actually, I'll repeat something I said. I went into Gaza at the beginning of 2005 after Prime Minister Sharon had announced that he was going to withdraw. And Ziad Abu Amr invited me to speak to the Gaza Council on Foreign Relations. And I went in, there were about maybe 200, 250 people there, including, by the way, the whole leadership of Hamas. I saw Mahmoud Zahar as I was walking in. And before I could say anything, after I saw him, Ziad said to me, we thought the opposition should hear you. So I went in and I made a speech where I said, look, Palestinians have never controlled their own destiny. There's always been someone, Yasser Arafat told me when we were at Camp David, he would have gone to the original Camp David if it hadn't been for the Soviets and the Syrians preventing him. So I said, no one's going to prevent you now. Israel's withdrawing, and you have a chance to turn Gaza into Shimon Peres would say a Singapore or a Hong Kong. But if you turn it into a platform for attacks against
Trump now
Israel,
speaks about a Riviera.
exactly. But that's the current one. But I said, if you turn it into a platform for attacks against Israel, who's going to say, gee, that's a good model? Now, no one from the audience wanted to engage on that. What do they want to say? Instead, every question I got was, the U.S. is an honest broker. Because you're too closely aligned with Israel, you're not an honest broker. So I came back and I said, the George W. Bush administration hasn't been a broker at all. Not an honest broker, not a dishonest broker, not a broker at all. It walked away. Because here we were. This was the beginning of 2005. It walked away. Can anybody here tell me that you're better off? This was the second intifada. 4 years of second intifada. Can anybody here tell me you're better off? This audience, which was not shy, no one raised their hand. No one said they were better off. I said, the U.S. didn't prevent the European Union, the Russians, the UN, didn't prevent anybody from coming in and playing this role, but nobody did. And the reason nobody did is because they didn't have any influence on Israel. You don't want an honest broker. You need an effective broker. We have a relationship with Israel. We're the only ones who are able to influence them. So you need us to exercise that influence. But that means you also have to be responsible. We have to get the Israelis to be responsible, and you have to be responsible. Nothing about a special relationship with Israel means we can't have a special relationship with you. And understand, an effective broker is one that understands we cannot address the needs of either side unless we're addressing the needs of both sides. A mediator is about understanding the needs of each side and ensuring that those needs get addressed. We can't address the Israeli needs, even if we want to, if we can't also address your needs.
Dennis, when I look at you, I've known you for a long time, and when I hear you today, there's one person that keeps coming back to my mind in the last, 40 minutes that we're talking about, that's Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
So in so many ways, you're kind of the next generation of Henry Kissinger, right? You worked with presidents, you worked on the Cold War. He's the architect of the Israeli-Arab, in some ways, even the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Can you say a few words about what you learned from him, what you take, just speak about Henry Kissinger for a couple of minutes.
What's ironic is I am doing a biography of him right now.
Oh, you are?
I am. I was asked to do it. It's the first time I've just finished one book and still sort of have it in mind, and I'm talking about it, but I'm writing a new one, and I knew him well. I discovered only in the process, by the way, of doing my research on him, that during the transition from Reagan to Bush, he sent a note to Baker, and I still don't know if he just was volunteering it or Baker had asked him, but he went through names and personalities of people who Baker should not listen to and who Baker should bring on. And I won't go through the people that he was negative about, but here I find he describes me as someone he has to have, that Baker has to have. So this was a revelation to me. I spent a lot of time with him over the years. There's two things I would say about him that are really important. He had not just a worldview, but a construct. And the construct was driven by what affected his worldview. Look, he was a Jewish refugee out of Germany. He was 15 years old when he came to the United States. It was very important to him to prove he was an American. He goes into the military. He wins the Bronze Star, something that he never talks about. People don't think about Henry Kissinger as having humility. Never talks about the Bronze Star, plays down his bravery. And it's all part of his developing and projecting who he was. He was an American. Yes, he was a refugee, but he was an American. But that construct was influenced by where he came from and what he saw. He saw the worst in humanity, and he saw you had to build a hedge against that. He becomes a believer in sort of the balance of power in no small part because of that. He says one thing about Americans, as much as he admires America, and he almost views it in a wondrous fashion. He says Americans have no history with evil, and therefore they have no premonition of catastrophe. He has an experience with evil, and he feels because catastrophe can take place, you have to build all the hedges against it. You have to believe in power. So I will say one of the interesting things about him, when he's criticized for a lack of morality because he's prepared to deal with the Soviets, he opens with the Chinese. One of his answers is preventing nuclear war and a humanitarian catastrophe. That's not a moral issue. I mean, I find him very interesting because of the construct, because of he has an approach to negotiations. He focused very heavily, and again, maybe because of the sense that of this premonition of catastrophe, and you don't produce nirvana. You're not. Everybody's not going to come and sing Kumbaya together for him. So his view, his approach to negotiations is, I'm going to do the things that guarantee that we won't face war. We will reduce the risk of conflict. We will manage it. We'll try to produce long-term stability. He thinks more that way than he thinks in terms of, I'm going to create this reconciliation. Now, I'm attracted to some of that, but I also am more of a believer that reconciliation is possible, even if it isn't possible immediately.
So basically, I just want to say that in my humble way, in the way I understand the Middle East, you're like the next generation of Henry Kissinger in the following sense. Henry Kissinger created the architecture of the Middle East through the Camp David Accords of 1978, 1979, that basically created a framework for Israeli-Arab peace that then led to the Israel-Jordan peace. It led to the Oslo Accords. And I don't think there would have been an Abraham Accords without the Camp David Accords of 1978. And I heard that from leaders in the Gulf were saying Sadat opened the door for us. Without Sadat, we could not have gone through with the Abraham Accords. So really, and Kissinger was right there, and knowing how to play both sides and bring Israel to the table. And we know that Israel is not always the easiest client to deal with, to say the least.
And by the way, he would say that.
Yeah. So maybe we should do a whole separate thing about the Middle East. Obviously, we should. You and I, we could have a conversation about that forever. I do want to close. I know we are running out of time. I want to ask you a few quick questions. From your perspective, statecraft, who's the most remarkable, non-living leader when it comes to Jewish statecraft? Non-living.
I will tell you, I think Rabin was. Rabin was analytical, and he focused on objectives. He was the most intellectually honest leader I ever dealt with. If we would have a debate and you couldn't move him because he thought everything through, if it turned out he was wrong, he would admit he was wrong. I've never had a leader. And so, I mean, he was clear on his objectives, and he focused on what were the means. So I would say, I think he was the best practitioner that I dealt
so
with.
Basically, everybody who wants to see a demonstration of that should check out the speech of Rabin at the Israeli National Defense College in November 1992. It's a remarkable speech because in this speech, right, it's an incredible speech because he actually sees the rise of Iran as a threat to Israel, and he envisions a whole way of dealing with Iran. So I know that the current Prime Minister Netanyahu says that he was the first, but actually on record, it was Rabin, way years before. Second, who's the most inspiring living Jewish leader in the field of statecraft? Maybe it's an empty group. It's a Jewish statecraft. I'm not talking Israel.
Oh, a Jewish statecraft?
For the Jewish people.
Well, I'll tell you, someone who I greatly admire and who has been a visionary in a lot of respects, I would say Natan Sharansky.
Oh my God, number one, of course. Yes. I think he's the most respectable, a living Jewish personality today.
In every sense, both his Jewish values and again, his honesty.
And his morality, his modesty.
Yes.
Just an incredible, inspiring human being. I hope to bring him on here one day as well. So if you had $1 million to donate in the space of statecraft, who would get that $1 million?
In the Jewish world?
Yes. Jewish statecraft.
I would say actually, I mean, that this is maybe a conflict of interest, but it doesn't go to me personally.
That's okay.
JPPI.
Fantastic.
I mean, I
Good
think in
answer.
terms of across the board, what it's doing on focusing, connecting the diaspora and Israel, on trying to affect things, reform within Israel, uh, trying to understand better how to both the nature of diaspora attitudes, especially in the U.S., but also how to affect them. That's where I would put it.
What books are you reading now?
Well, because I'm doing this book on Kissinger, most of the books I'm reading are related to his background. Um, but I'm also, so I mean, it's reading a lot of different biographies of him. Um, I also have Leon Aron's biography. I mean, not biography. He wrote a really searing book on Putin and the Russians. So I'm reading that as well. Um, I'm not. I mean, my wife says I'm too. You know her, Debbie. I'm a little too narrow. She'd like to broaden me in terms I should be reading some fiction, and I'm not.
Yes, of course. Yes, known criticism. Anyhow, last thing. What podcasts are you listening to?
Say it again.
What podcasts? What are you listening to?
Ah, well, David Makovsky has a very good podcast, and I listened to that. Dan Senor has a very good podcast, and I listen to that. Uh, those are kind of my two leading ones. There is a Bill Simmons podcast in sports because I am a sports fan. Anybody who's a sports fan, you should listen to the Bill Simmons podcast.
You played basketball, right?
I did, yeah. And I have a grandson who's 13 who is really good.
And you played for your synagogue team or something. Is that
I did,
true
yeah,
rumor?
yeah, I did. And I will say, I can't find it. There's a photograph that was in Marie where they took at one of my games where I look like I'm about 5 feet off the ground leaping. And I wish I could find that. And I can't find it, but it was in Marie. And if anybody can find that, I would be extremely appreciative and grateful.
All right, Dennis, we're coming to an end. Do you have like a closing word before we finish?
Yeah, I would just say it is so important for a kind of self-consciousness among the Jewish people, given where we're at. There's a narrative out there that is determined to delegitimize Israel. And when you delegitimize Israel, you're saying basically the Jewish people don't have a right to a state. Well, we do. And we have to come up with the best means of not only of making the case for it. What Israel's doing right now is demonstrating it will fight for itself, but we have not just a military argument to make. We have to dominate this discussion. We have to create a better narrative about not just the legitimacy, but also the value of the Jewish state and its contribution to civilization.
Dennis, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to have you. And I hope it's not the last time.
Gidi, it's so easy for you and I to talk. I'm happy to do it anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Friends, if you made it to this point, you just had the pleasure of listening to one of the most thoughtful people in the field of national security in America. You can read more about his ideas in his book Statecraft 2.0, which is the seminal book in the field. What's special about Dennis Ross is that he uniquely applied his talents to thinking about the future of the Jewish people. A national security strategy for the Jewish people? It sounds like a conceptual mismatch. National security and Jewish people. But I argue that the Jewish people is a unique entity which merits a robust national security approach, just like nations. In fact, much of my work and the work of the Root Institute focused on this challenge. You can read more about that in page 124 of my book, Flexigidity. Furthermore, I argue that Israel's national security strategy must be affected by its aspiration to serve as the nation-state of the Jewish people. You can read more about this idea in page 213 of Flexigidity. These are big ideas, and we will come back to discuss them in future episodes. That's it for today's episode of Flexigidity, the podcast of the Hebrew Man. Please share, subscribe, and stay tuned. See you next time.